So as you can see, we now receive hitback from Hey YouTube, how's it going? So today's video, this is going to be a tutorial on making a hitbox and hurtbox system that you can extend, you can implement. It should just slot into pretty much anything you're working on, and it should be that simple to just work. But the key thing about this tutorial is good design, and designing this so it can be extended to fit your needs, but it functions for what it is, a hitbox slash hurtbox system. So when I talk about hitbox and hurtboxes, this is what I mean. A hitbox is something that deals damage. There's an area, and if something touches it, it takes damage. A hurtbox is something that is used to detect damage. So when you say a hurtbox, that's pretty much in any multiplayer game. There's invisible hurt boxes on your limbs, or any shooting game, in any fighting game. There's hurt boxes around your player, and then there's hitboxes being thrown out that are either attached to the other character's limbs, they're attached to bullets, and they hit things. Now, there's two ways you could do it, and honestly, you can do it either way. But for this tutorial, I think it's best to put it in the hitbox. Put it in the actual projectile. So say you're shooting a bullet. What I mean by you can do it both ways is you can have the projectile, every update, it can check for a hit. In Unity, this is done via on trigger enter or on collision enter. And that happens every frame in the physics update. So every frame, it's going to say, have we hit something? Have we hit something? And if we have, apply the damage. So if we have hit something, we apply. Or, now this is an or, you could have your hurt box also do the check for hits. You can make an invisible hurt box. You can make a sphere collider around this. And then on trigger enter this, and this is a trigger. And you could on trigger enter, so when the hitbox comes into contact with the trigger, then apply. Now, both methods require a little bit of not the best code, but it's necessary code. And what I mean by that is you have a projectile here, and it's carrying some information. It's carrying damage, it's carrying knockback, a knockback force of vector 3. This projectile has that information. So how do you translate that to health? You have health over here. How do we get the health? How do we get this stuff to the health through this hitbox? So I'm going to show you. And I'm going to show you in the way that I typically like to do it, and that's by doing things in the hitbox itself. So we have a hitbox. We have a hurtbox. And then we have a player health. Player health. It's very simple to just keep these in separate things, and it'll help you stay organized. So let's open these up. I'm going to close all the other ones. Let's open up hurtbox, and let's open up player health. Player health is very simple. It's just going to be a public float health, and we don't need this stuff. Very simple. Now the hurtbox isn't actually going to do anything other than signify that this is something that can be hit. Now, this isn't actually necessary a lot of the time, but all you really need in here is a public reference to the health. So you need a public player health. So this hurtbox is going to know how to talk back to the player. And in most cases, you're also going to want a reference to your character's physics in some way. So in my instance, I write my own physics. If you have a rigid body, you do a rigid body here. But I'm just going to say a public character control. And the hurtbox doesn't need any of these things. It's just a holder for information. Now the hitbox is where the real information goes. So we have a public float damage, say it'll do 20. We'll have a public vector3 knockback. And we'll say new vector3 0, 5, 15. Oops, I missed a 0 there. Cool. So this is the hitbox. Now, here's the important part. We have an on trigger enter. I prefer to use triggers because you can extend a trigger outside the actual render radius of the collision. That way, for fast moving objects, you're going to run into problems where collisions don't trigger and you have to write your own collision solving because Unity can't handle that. And in games in general, it's good to give, for certain things, a little bit of a generous hitbox that's bigger than the visuals. So I always like making it a sphere trigger, and I put it around whatever it actually is. So we have an on trigger enter. This is a nice little piece of code that I think everybody should use, layer mask. This is where you can distinguish what things you want to and not want to check instantly. This should be public. So right now, let's say we're in the on trigger enter, something entered. What you would do is check first if that object is in the layer of things we care about, because if it isn't, you're just going to be wasting a lot of efficiency. Because the actual code we want in here is we're going to do a hurtbox h is equal to other.getComponent hurtbox. Not other.getComponent hurtbox. And then if the hurtbox is there, so we hit something and it has a hurtbox. So if the hurtbox is not null, we do h.playerHealth. I thought there was a public reference to player health. Oh, health. h.health.fhealth minus equals the damage. Now we're also going to need to do another instance of a transferal here. So we're going to have to do h.cc, which is the character controller in my case. Move direction is equal. We'll just say it's equal to the knockback for now. That's very simple. But what the layer mask does is makes it so you don't do this on every single time something enters the trigger, because get component is a very expensive call, and you don't want to be calling this every single frame. What you want to do is, I'm actually going to refer to another code base that I use. And where do I keep the... And that other piece of code looks like this. So I don't know exactly what this piece of code does, but I will try to explain. It's saying it's performing a Boolean or a bit shift comparison between your layer mask and the layer of the collider object. So it's saying if this layer exists within the mask, do the rest of this. So this way, you're not running this get component call on everything your bullet interacts with. Now, you might want it to. You might want it to hit everything and do some, on hit effects. And what we can do here is actually add an on hit to just destroy this game object. And we're going to add a little bit of efficiency in here. So for this hurtbox, we are assuming that this hurtbox is going to be parented to the player in some way. You could make it not do that, but for the sake of this, we're going to assume that it is. So we're just going to say health is equal to transform.getComponent in parent, which is recursive, by the way. It goes all the way up to the parent. And we're going to get component in parent player health. And then we're going to do the same thing with the character controller. We'll just copy this. And this is character controller. And then in player health. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, so that's just a little bit of efficiency so we don't have to drag and drop. If you miss it in the inspector, dragging and dropping becomes much less annoying to deal with. So, hopping back over into the project, I have this little bullet prefab, which, as you can see, it has a sphere collider around it, which has a trigger on it. So let's go ahead and increase the radius on this a little bit, give it a generous hitbox. And then we're going to add to this a hitbox. In the layer mask for now, we're just going to we'll do default, which I believe our player is in the default layer. They are. And that's actually all you need to do on your bullet prefab. Now let's head back over to the player. We need to add a hurtbox. Actually, I'll show you a disjointed hurtbox. Add player health on the base, and then let's add a 3D child object to this. Disable the mesh render for now, make it a trigger, scale it up a little bit, so we've got a pretty generous hitbox around us. Hurtbox, forgive me. And then we just add a hurtbox component to it. You can drag and drop these in if you want to, but as you'll see when I run it, this won't matter. One other important thing is, when dealing with collisions in Unity, at least one of, I believe, at least one of these objects needs a rigid body on it. We could test this by seeing if it works, because this should not work. My player health should not move, even though I will get hit. As you can see, those are going through me, and I'm getting hit. So the reason is the collision's never triggering. So let's just go to our bullet, and let's add a rigid body component. Disable gravity, make kinematic, and freeze the position of the rigid body. This is very important. Make sure you lock these constraints. Make sure to apply that to the prefab, go back, and now you'll see we have knockback and the hits collide with us. And if we want to, we can go ahead and change our layer. We are now transparent, and the bullets fly right through us. So this is how you can distinguish friendly fire and non-friendly fire. You just set the layer of the characters. And then you could just distinguish friendly fire. Now, let's extend this a little bit, because I said this was extendable. What if we want the knockback from the projectile to be the knockback that we applied to the player? Well, first thing, I'm going to move this down, so we'll get an upwards knockback. That's very simple, actually. We have our hitbox, which is generic. You can do it two ways. You get a callback in the hitbox, for whenever it hits something, it'll say, hey, projectile, I hit something. That could be tedious, because what happens if you put a hitbox on something that isn't a projectile? So, what I like to do is I take my projectile class, which is very simple, and instead we extend this by making this a projectile that is also a hitbox. Now this way, it has all the code of the hitbox and its own code. And so that way, you can override you can override this function. We could have a let's say a private, or not private, can't be, protected abstract void on hit. Or it can't be abstract, sorry. So I could put all this in on hit, and then just call on hit here because we hit something valid. And now in our projectile class, let's pass in the hurtbox. Box H to here. Now, in our projectile class, all we have to do is do a protected override void of our on hit. Oh, this has to be marked as an abstract class. Give me. Why is this not? Not declare body because it's marked as abstract. Oh, virtual. This doesn't actually have to be an abstract class now. It just has to be right. Hmm? Protected virtual void on hit. Or does it actually have to be an abstract class? Might have to. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you just override the on hit, and we could say the same thing. H dot health dot minus equals our damage, but then we could handle our knockback here. Dot move direction is equal to v3 direction times. Now, whenever we hit the player, it will be knocked back in the direction of the bullet. Let's see. Oh, right? Because the projectile now is the hitbox. We say we hit everything, and this should work. Oh, I have not applied these to the prefab. Hmm? Prefab contains an invalid. No, it does not. Prefab, open in context, remove, save, go back. Okay, this should now work. So as you can see, we now receive hit back from the projectiles. So the code is going from the projectile into the hurt box and then into the player controller. And you can customize that any way you want. You can pick whatever layers you want to transfer. So a common issue I run into whenever I'm making a game is how do I just apply knockback in general to any enemy type? So for that, if you're using rigid bodies or character controllers, you could just get the character controller component and set it directly. But the thing you really want to avoid is having specific hitboxes for everything. Like each one has to do something different to do the same thing, if you know what I mean. So say instead of a bullet, I had a static hitbox here. There's now a static hitbox. It's not moving. So this code doesn't really apply. It doesn't have a direction and a speed. You could use a projectile if you wanted to, and just not have it move. Just never do the shoot. But that's kind of wasted code. So how do we make a new hitbox, a new type of hitbox? We can make an area hitbox that's essentially just an extension of the hitbox, and then a different way of applying the knockback. And you could easily do that. All you'd have to do is just make a new area hitbox that extends the hitbox class that we made, and then just override the on hit method. And then boom, Any on hit you want to apply, you have access to it. And the hurt box has access to all the things we need. So whenever you need to access something, so say we have stamina, like they have stamina depending on where you're storing that. So you have to add that. Either add a reference in the hurt box, or you have some sort of manager class on the player that manages all of their relevant things and passes it down. So say this is becoming bloated. We have a stamina in here, stamina. We have a public mana, which don't exist. This is getting a bit bloated now. Every hurt box is going to need a reference to these things. You're going to have to do this 4 times for every hurt box for every character, which it runs on start, so it's not really that inefficient, but it can seem bloated. Like you're going to have a lot of references in your hurt box. So what you could do is just make a manager class for your player, and instead of referencing all of these, the hurt box only needs a reference to the manager class, and then the manager has the reference to all of these for a given entity, and then can delegate them. And the beauty of this is that you can just drag a hitbox on something else, or a hurt box on something else, and as long as it has the relevant the relevant manager, then it would work for anything. Say you make a barrel, a physics barrel that you want to get hit. Well, instead of going, it doesn't have all these, so you need to make a new hurt box. And then that means if you make a new hurt box, you got to go into your hitbox and change this to say, does it have a hurt box? Yes or no? Okay, it does. If it doesn't, does it have this new physics object hurt box? To avoid that, you could have in Hurtbox, you could have like an entity manager system, and then a way to apply any amount of things you would ever want. So in say, I'll write it below in its own file, or in this file for now. So you'd have a public entity manager class, public class entity manager, and this is gonna have all of this stuff, and it's gonna have a public void on hit. And you're going to want to pass in a damage. You're going to want some vector 3 knockback. You're going to have some afloat stamina, degen. And then you could set defaults for it. That way, if you don't want to apply these, you don't have to. Say float mana damage. I don't think you could do... Yeah, you can't do that one. They could just have some default values. Damage is probably mandatory, or you just say 0. So now, this entity manager, instead of getting the hurt box in your hitbox, you would get the entity manager, and then tell the entity manager, I hit this thing, you deal with it. So now, you would have an entity manager for... You'd override your entity manager by doing like a public physics object entity manager, which extends entity manager. And then in here, you would override the on hit. You would do public, oh, this is a class. Override void on hit. And then, So that way, all it has to do is get your physics object, or all it has to do is get your entity manager. And then once it gets your entity manager, it'll call on hit. But because it's an inherited class, it'll run the override version. And that way, you don't have to change your hitboxes at all. Your hitboxes won't see a difference. And this makes a very sustainable, less tech debt, extendable version of a hitbox and a hurtbox. As always with my tutorials, you can find a link to this down in the description. If you want to download the code, this is an extension of 2 other tutorials. The one on projectile prediction, which you can see in action, and one I'm currently working on movement speed capping. So, if you've liked this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you want more Unity tutorials. Tell me if there's ones in particular you want tutorials on. If you think there aren't sufficient coverage for it on YouTube, please let me know. I'll see you next time.